Nestor Makhno, the anarchist Robin Hood of the steppes. Imagine a world in total collapse. Two massive empires are tearing each other apart, and in the heart of this bloody chaos stands one man. He holds no crown, he commands no Politburo, and he has zero mercy for those in power. What he does have is a black flag, a death-defying laugh, and a horse-drawn carriage mounted with a machine gun that moves faster than destiny itself. His name was Nestor Makhno, the Batka, or father, of the Ukrainian steppes, a man who made both the Red Star and the White Guard tremble with fear. To some, he was a liberator. To others, a bandit and a butcher. But above all, he was an anarchist with a vision, a revolutionary with a sharp tongue, and an inexhaustible supply of sheer audacity. Today, step by step, we will reconstruct his journey. From a starving peasant boy in the village of Guerrilla to a legend whose name is still spoken with both dread and admiration. A man with a machine gun and a sense of humor. The story of Nestor Makhno plays out like a gritty western filmed on old shaky film stock, where every frame smells of gunpowder, horse sweat, and the endless promise of freedom for all. But don't be too quick to label him as just another warlord or folk hero. Makhno was an anarchist with an imagination. He could spark a village revolt, make enemy cavalry dance under machine gun fire, and then sign an alliance with the very people he was cursing just yesterday. Today, we're going to strip away the myths and legends, with irony, without pretension, but with deep respect for the facts and the laughter that was often his only weapon, as sharp as a bullet. Childhood of an Anarchist. How a village boy became the empire's worst nightmare. They say you aren't born an anarchist, you become one. But if anyone could have predicted that little Nestor from Guerrilla would one day turn half of Ukraine upside down, his mother probably would have asked the priest for a special prayer for a quiet child while he was still in the cradle. He was born in 1888 into a peasant family so poor that the word poverty doesn't quite do it justice. This wasn't just a lack of money. It was a brutal struggle for survival. Their entire estate consisted of an old shed, a few chickens, and an incredible capacity to endure whatever government came to collect taxes next. His father died early, leaving 5 children and a widow with a garden that looked more like a tiny survival training ground than a source of food. Little Nestor learned early on that life was fundamentally unfair. While other children might have dreamed of sweets, he dreamed of having a pair of boots without holes in them. In Guerrilla, there were 3 kinds of people: those who worked, those who commanded, and those who got whipped for looking the wrong way. Makhno quickly realized he didn't want to be the first or the third, and he categorically disagreed with the second on principle. School was another adventure. On paper, he was a student. In reality, he was the star of every local brawl. Literacy came to him with more difficulty than the art of accurately throwing stones at the landlord's fence. His teachers said the boy had a sharp mind, but fists that were far too hot. However, it was there that he first encountered the idea that all men are equal. Granted, when he tried to equalize a wealthy local boy and a barefoot classmate using a brick, he was suspended for a week. His teenage years were spent in a cycle of work, fight, and run from the police. He worked as a day laborer for wealthy landowners, but spent most of his time antagonizing the local authorities. His first arrest was as natural as rain after thunder. He was caught liberating apples from someone else's orchard. Nestor claimed it was his first act of grassroots self-governance. But the judge didn't appreciate the joke and sentenced him to a public flogging. Year after year, anger toward an unjust world built up inside him. Yet, even then, he knew how to temper that anger with humor. When neighbors asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Makhno would reply, "The Chief of Justice." Little did they know that years later, he would fulfill that wish from the back of a machine gun carriage, making the Russian Empire itself tremble with fear. A young rebel behind bars, the University of Hard Labor. They say prison is a school of life. For Nestor Makhno, it was more like a university of revolution. No degrees, just a free education in philosophy and a PhD in survival. His first serious arrest happened while he was still a teenager. The local police knew his face better than his own mother did. The charge? Participation in an armed raid on a nobleman's estate. According to Nestor, he was simply returning stolen goods to the poor. According to the state, he was robbing everyone in sight. The court went with the version where Makhno was a villain and sent him to a hard labor prison for several years. At first, he thought prison was just 4 walls, bread, and water. But it turned out to be a whole world with its own laws. Here, peasants, thieves, political exiles, and random victims of the Tsar system lived together like a tiny, dysfunctional state. In this state, Makhno learned fast. If you don't learn, you get a pot of stew over your head or lose your last crust of bread. His most important lesson came from befriending political prisoners, real anarchists and revolutionaries. It was there he first heard that the state is the ultimate bandit and the people are its victims. His teachers were men who read Bakunin and Kropotkin with the same intensity that thieves used to read the room before a heist. Every conversation was like a spark in dry hay. Makhno realized his childhood hatred for authority wasn't just a personal grudge. It was a political philosophy. If you think people get their profession at a university, you're wrong. Makhno became a professional rebel in the prison cells of the Tsar. Life there was far from romantic. The stench, the brawls, the freezing bunks, it all left its mark on his character. But he also learned how to survive, how to negotiate, and how to organize people around him. Even in a prison barrack, he managed to set up a sort of village council to decide who got an extra piece of bread and who needed re-education through extra work. The irony? The future destroyer of all governments began building his first republic right behind bars. Soon, he had a reputation as a guy who wasn't afraid of the guards, the older inmates, or fate itself. One fellow prisoner later recalled, "Makhno was always laughing, even when they were beating him. He said pain was just the state's way of reminding you how stupid it is." By the end of his sentence, Makhno knew 2 golden rules. Rule 1: the world is unfair, and someone has to do something about it. Rule 2: if you can't change the system, make it absolutely terrified of you. He carried those lessons back to the outside world, where an even more chaotic stage was waiting for him. A revolution and the first People's Army, made of men just as stubborn, hungry, and angry as he was. The first revolution: chaos, hope, and blood in the streets. The revolution of 1905 looked like this. The entire country is screaming, everyone is demanding something, and the authorities pretend nothing is happening until paving stones and human heads start rolling down the street. For Nestor Makhno, this was the chance to see if his dreams of justice worked outside of kitchen talk. Returning from prison, he found his home village of Guerrilla just as poor as before. only twice as angry. Peasants were cursing the landlords were cursing the peasants, and the police were hitting anyone within reach. Young Makhno realized it was time to stop stealing apples solo and start seizing power as a group. His first anarchist band was born almost by accident. A few guys bound by hunger, hatred for the elites, and a love for a good fight gathered behind a barn. They decided that justice wasn't going to walk in on its own. They had to bring it in on a stolen horse. They started with raids on estates. Wealthy owners quickly realized that Nestor wasn't just a local hoodlum. He was a man with principles. He took from the rich and gave to the poor, and occasionally kept an equal share if there was enough to go around. Revolution in a village looks like a giant marketplace. Everyone is shouting about freedom, but nobody knows what to do with it if they actually catch it. Makhno quickly became a folk avenger, respected even by those who had feared him. They started calling him Batka, father, even though at the time he looked more like a pissed-off teenager with a club than a legendary leader. Naturally, the Tsar's government wasn't going to just watch. Police units arrived in the village to restore order. But order, as usual, meant breaking down doors, arresting everyone in sight, and promising even higher taxes. In response, the peasants under Makhno staged their first small rebellion, which ended in blood and the police fleeing for their lives. Nestor realized that the state doesn't fear individuals. It fears a crowd with pitchforks and stones. But the rebellion had a price. Raids, arrests, and interrogations followed. Makhno found himself on the edge of the gallows, but fate gave him a reprieve. During these years, he learned the core truth. Revolution isn't a pretty poster. It's constant struggle, dirt, blood, and the very real risk of dying not as a hero, but as just another unknown insurgent. Even in his darkest moments, Makhno kept his sense of humor. Once, when a policeman asked why he kept stirring up the people, Nestor replied, "Just to make life a little less boring." And perhaps it was that laughter that made him more dangerous than any weapon. Because a man who can laugh at power is the ultimate nightmare for those who rely on fear to rule. From the Great War to the birth of the legend, the Great War and the little man with massive plans. For most peasants, World War I looked like a bizarre whim of the elite. Somewhere far away, someone picked a fight. But the blood was being spilled in your own backyard. Nestor Makhno, by this time a graduate of the prison university, was swept into the vortex of war. Not because of patriotism, but because of a simple law in the empire. If you are poor and young, your place is at the front, with a rifle and no choice. The mobilization was loud. They took men by the village load. Makhno tried to argue that he was an expert in freedom, not military drill. But the officer explained that patriotism means not asking questions. And so, Nestor found himself in the Tsar's army, where the discipline hit harder than a rifle butt and the food felt more like a punishment than a meal. At the front, he realized two things. First, bullets don't care if you're for the Tsar or for freedom. Second, war isn't a heroic painting with flags and charging horses. It's mud, lice, endless orders, and the rare moments when you simply manage to survive. Despite his anarchist heart, Makhno was no fool. He was a cautious soldier. He shot straight. But he looked at the officers as if he were already planning their overthrow from the trenches. When the front began to crumble and soldiers started deserting en masse, Makhno knew this wasn't his war. He returned to Guerrilla, where the home front was met with bitterness. Many sons were dead. Bread was scarce, and the government's promises were the only thing in abundance. It was here that Nestor finally decided that freedom wasn't just a word on a poster. It was something you had to take with your own hands, preferably with machine gun support. Rumor has it, this was when the idea of the Makhnovist Volnitsa, the free territory, was born. A state without bosses, laws, or taxes. A place with a fair division of bread and the right for any peasant to tell a manager to go to hell. It sounded like a beautiful utopia. But Nestor planned to build it in his usual style. If anyone stands in the way of freedom, it's time to lock and load. The empire wanted to turn a peasant into a soldier. It accidentally created a guerrilla leader who would soon become the nightmare of anyone trying to rule Ukraine. The birth of Makhnovshchina. How the Tachanka became the argument for freedom. After the 1917 revolution, the empire shattered faster than a glass at a village wedding. Power vanished. New parties argued in the capitals. But in Guerrilla, the peasants asked the eternal question, who's the boss now, and how much will the taxes be? Nestor Makhno's answer made the bureaucrats' hair turn gray. The boss is nobody. The taxes are zero. In the spring of that year, he organized the Guerrilla Soviet of Peasant Deputies, a real village parliament without ties or empty words. The meetings were loud. Someone wanted land, someone wanted bread, someone just wanted the landlord kicked out. Makhno listened to everyone, but he made decisions fast. Landlords out, land to the peasants, officials to the gate. "Will, that is our law," he would say, and the room would explode in cheers, occasionally punctuated by the sound of a pistol being cocked just in case someone doubted the justice of it all. The ideas of anarchy spread like candy to a hungry child. Soldiers returning from the Great War were drawn to Makhno like magnets. They were tired of orders and someone else's wars. Guerrilla units formed instantly. They knew nothing of military science, but they knew their goal: get the land back and kick out any superior who dared to command. But enemies appeared fast. In the spring of 1918, Austro-German troops marched into Ukraine. Their mission was simple: take the grain to Germany, maintain order with bayonets, and send the dissenters to the gallows. In Guerrilla, they started with raids and arrests. A German officer once declared, "We bring civilization." A local peasant dryly replied, "Better bring bread and take your civilization back with you." Makhno realized that without resistance, the villages would be picked clean. His unit had only a few dozen fighters, armed with rifles from the Turkish War and an enthusiasm that was hard to kill. They began ambushing German patrols and burning supply trains. The newspapers called it peasant banditry, but the peasants said, "This is us taking our own back." This was the moment the legendary symbol of Makhnovshchina was born, the Tachanka. Legend says they found an old Maxim machine gun at a wrecked fortification. They grabbed horses and a carriage from a nearby yard. "There's your revolution," Makhno said, mounting the gun on the cart. The Tachanka became the terror of the steppes. It tore across the plains, spitting lead, as the peasants laughed. Speed like the devil, teeth like a wolf. Their first major battle occurred in the summer of 1918 at the village of Dubrovka. The Germans had set up a garrison, confident that a peasant mob would scatter at the sight of a regular army. Instead, the Tachankas flew into their positions, machine guns singing like crickets in July. Within an hour, only panic and abandoned weapons remained of the garrison. This was the birth of the Makhnovist army. The word spread. Our Nestor is like a storm. He hits, vanishes, and the Germans are gone. The more Makhno won, the higher the price on his head became. The occupation authorities offered a reward big enough to buy a house, a cow, and a barrel of moonshine. But no one betrayed him. The villagers said, "Betraying Makhno is like giving your last crust of bread to the enemy." By autumn, his force grew to several hundred. They had former soldiers, workers, and even deserters from the Ukrainian Haidamach units, who were fed up with the puppet dictator, Hetman Skoropadsky. Makhno created his own revolutionary tribunals, courts without bureaucrats, dealing with landlords and police. Often the sentence was short and sounded like a burst of machine gun fire. He was now a commander, though he called himself first among equals. He was a strategist, a propagandist, and a joker. When a captured German officer asked why they were rebelling, Nestor replied, "So you'll think twice before coming here with a gun next time." Thus began the People's War for Will, where laws were written in blood and wit, and the Tachanka became the fastest symbol of freedom the world had ever seen. War with everyone, turning the Civil War into a circus act. By late 1918, Nestor Makhno was more than just a partisan. He was the Botka, a word that sounded like a sacred spell in the villages. His units grew like spring weeds, swelling from hundreds to thousands. But as his army grew, so did the list of his enemies. First, there were the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian and German troops retreating after their defeat in the Great War. They were leaving slowly, burdened with looted grain. Makhno couldn't let them leave with a parting gift. He served them a farewell dinner of Tachankas and machine guns under the slogan, "Not everything you stole will be useful to you." In the battles near Orakov and Berdyansk, the Makhnovists literally beat the grain trains out of them, leaving the enemy with nothing but empty wagons and shock. When the Germans left, Hetman Skoropadsky took the stage, backed by former Tsarist officers who loved order and someone else's land. But the Makhnovist order was different. In the summer of 1918, his units were hunting down the Hetman's police. The word in the villages was, "He who came for taxes left without his boots." Overthrowing the Hetman only added to the chaos. The Ukrainian People's Republic under Simon Petliura tried to build a state, but Makhno recognized no authority but the will of the people. Relations with the Petliurists soured instantly. They demanded obedience, and Nestor answered with machine gun fire. After a major fight near Gulyapol in December, Petliura noticeably lost his enthusiasm for educating the anarchists. Then, the white armies of Admiral Denikin moved in from the south. The whites wanted to restore the old order, the noble estates, and the spirit of serfdom that the peasants hated with every fiber of their being. "We didn't kick out the landlords just to welcome their children back with rifles," Makhno told his commanders. The war with the whites would be the ultimate test of his army. In January 1919, the Makhnovists captured Ekaterinoslav, now the city of Dnipro. Their posters appeared throughout the city, "Freedom or death." On the other side of the street, someone had added in chalk, "Freedom is better than death." But holding the city was impossible. The whites counterattacked, the Petliurists were scrambling, and the Bolsheviks were already sending telegrams offering to be friends against common enemies. And this is where it gets interesting. The first alliance with the Bolsheviks. Formally, they were allies, because both sides hated the whites. But trust was never part of the deal. Makhno knew the Bolsheviks would eventually try to take charge, and he wasn't about to trade his freedom for a red star. For now, they played the game. The Makhnovists helped the Red Army crush Denikin, while the Bolsheviks supplied guns and ammo, trying their best not to mention the word anarchy. A defining moment was the Battle of Mariupol in the spring of 1919. Makhno's cavalry and Tachankas acted like a steppe whirlwind, shredding the White Army's supply lines. The White General Slashchov later wrote that the Makhnovists don't fight by the rules, they fight by inspiration. Unfortunately for the Whites, that inspiration usually left them without artillery or supplies. But the Bolshevik alliance was like a pie with a nasty surprise. You never knew what was inside. Soon, Red commissars arrived, demanding that the Makhnovist units submit to Red Army discipline. Makhno's response was simple. We aren't against discipline, just the kind that stops us from living freely. Within a week, the commissars were kicked out of the camp, and rumors of the Makhnovist Volnitsa spread across Ukraine. By the end of the year, the war had become a long-running show. Today, Makhno fights the Whites, tomorrow the Petliurists, the day after he argues with the Bolsheviks, and by evening he's punishing someone for looting a peasant's barn. His name was a legend. Moscow newspapers called him a peasant bandit. But the people had a different proverb. If Makhno is here, there will be justice, at least for a few days. The peasants chose him because he didn't take their last cow or demand they kiss a bureaucrat's boot. In the chaos of the Civil War, a new force was rising. Anarchy with a Tachanka, a joke, and a machine gun, ready to challenge any power on earth. The Unholy Alliance and the Great Betrayal, uneasy allies, when Anarchy and Bolshevism played nice. By early 1919, Ukraine looked like a chessboard where 10 different people were playing at once, and not a single one of them knew the rules. White Guards and Red Army, Ukrainian nationalists and anarchists, foreign invaders and local warlords, everyone was moving their pieces. But the winner was usually whoever had the most Tachankas and the fewest doubts. Makhno had become the master of an entire southeastern region, and his name sounded like a death sentence for landlords and new bureaucrats alike. It was into this chaos that the Bolsheviks burst, extending a hand of friendship. The Red Army was fighting General Denikin's white troops, who were pushing north, threatening to break through to Moscow. Lenin realized he needed allies. And who better to handle cavalry raids than the Batka of the steppes, a man who could vanish and reappear faster than a commissar could write a liquidation order. In the spring of 1919, Bolshevik emissaries arrived in Gulyapol with an offer. The Whites are our common enemy. Let's help each other now, and we'll settle our differences later. Nestor's reply was classic Makhno. We aren't against help, as long as it doesn't come with chains. The deal was struck. The Bolsheviks provided machine guns and ammo, while the Makhnovists promised to crush the Whites, but without any Red commanders breathing down their necks. The joint operations began that summer. It was a bizarre symbiosis. Disciplined Red soldiers fighting alongside free-spirited peasants who listened more to the Batka's jokes than to the orders of the commissars. At first, it looked like total chaos, but the results were spectacular. In June, the famous Battle of Peregonovka took place. General Slashchov's white troops tried to seize a strategic region to cut off the Red advance. But the Makhnovist Tachankas, like steppe lightning, struck the flanks while the Reds held the line. The battle became a nightmare for the Whites. Maxim guns sang songs of freedom, and Makhno himself charged at the head of the cavalry, waving a Mauser. It was a total victory. After this success, the Makhnovists entered Ekaterinoslav. The city welcomed them as liberators. Peasants brought bread, and workers waved their caps. However, the Bolsheviks immediately began establishing their new order: committees, lists of suspicious persons, and new taxes. Makhno watched this with a squint and asked a commissar, "Are you making a revolution, or are you just building a new prison?" The commissar didn't answer, but the tension in the air was thick. The Allies continued to fight the Whites, but the cracks were widening. The Reds insisted that all units submit to Central Command, while the Makhnovists stubbornly held on to their Volnitsa, their free territory. "We can die together, but we won't live by your laws," Nestor said at a military council. Meanwhile, the war grew even bloodier. That autumn, the Makhnovists participated in a series of operations in southern Ukraine, kicking the Whites out of Melitopol and Berdyansk. Legend says they even captured an armored train that the Whites thought was an impregnable fortress. 2 days later, that same train was flying the black flag of anarchy and firing on its former masters. But even victories couldn't save the alliance. In every city the Reds entered, arrests of former officers, newspaper shutdowns, and executions of counter-revolutionaries began. Makhno saw yesterday's liberators turning into tomorrow's tyrants. "The only difference between you and the Tsar is the color of your flag," he once snapped at a commissar. The conversation ended with the sound of a pistol being cocked. By the end of the year, the alliance was as shaky as an old wagon. Both sides hated Denikin, but they knew that once he was gone, they'd be settling the score with each other. Nestor joked that their agreement was like a temporary truce with a thunderstorm. "It's not raining yet, but the lightning is already flashing." Allies turned enemies. When the Reds decided anarchy was a disease. The winter of 1919 brought snow, cold, and the first open fractures in the friendship between Makhno and the Bolsheviks. As the Whites retreated south, Moscow decided it was time to restore order. To the leaders of the revolution, someone who crushed White Guards but refused to follow orders wasn't a hero. They were a potential enemy. And at the top of their suspicious list was Nestor Ivanovich. The rift came down to two things: discipline and power. The Reds demanded that the Makhnovist forces be absorbed into the regular army under a single command. Makhno replied with his usual bluntness: "We could join the Red Army, but only if it stops being red and starts being ours." The answer was so clear that commissars began writing reports to Moscow about the Batka's insubordination. By January 1920, a paradoxical situation unfolded on the southern front. The Makhnovists, officially still allies of the Reds, were receiving orders to act as infantry. But they simply pretended not to hear. Lenin and Trotsky were nervous. They wanted to turn these guerrilla units into a manageable force. But they hit the wall of anarchist philosophy. An order isn't mandatory if it's stupid. The first major conflict flared up in Ekaterinoslav when Bolshevik units arrived. Commissars announced a new food requisition campaign, seizing grain from peasants for the army and the cities. But these were Makhno's peasants, and they gave their grain voluntarily to their own, not to men with stamps and revolvers. "We share our bread, but not when you treat us like cows," Nestor said at a rally. A day later, the Bolshevik requisition squad left the village empty-handed and with bruised faces. Trotsky was furious. In March, he sent a telegram to Kharkov, calling the Makhnovists a band that obstructs the building of Soviet power. Makhno responded not with a letter, but with new raids against the Whites, showing the people, "We aren't enemies of the revolution, we are enemies of the new Tsars." The breakup became inevitable. In May 1920, the Red Army tried to disarm the Makhnovists under the guise of reorganizing the front. But anarchists don't like being disarmed. In the village of Alexandrovsk, the first serious fight broke out between the former allies. The Reds came with an armored train and an order to surrender weapons. They left without the train and with a crowd of prisoners to whom the Makhnovists gave a lecture. Don't confuse revolution with dictatorship. After that, the relationship collapsed completely. Trotsky signed an order to liquidate the Makhnovist units as counter-revolutionary. The hunt for the Batka was on across all of Ukraine. But Makhno knew how to vanish. His units dissolved into the steppes, hitting the Reds from the rear and raiding supply depots to give the food back to the peasants. That summer, a full-scale war raged. It was a never-ending guerrilla duel. Red columns moved in lines, while Makhnovists moved in Tachankas and cavalry, appearing from nowhere and disappearing so fast that the headquarters maps became meaningless scribbles. In August 1920, the Makhnovists conducted a daring raid on Ekaterinoslav. The Bolsheviks had just set up their committees. By the next morning, they were being chased out, and newspapers carried the headline, "The Gulyai Pole Volnitsa has returned." It didn't last long. The Reds brought in armored trains and heavy artillery, and the Makhnovists slipped back into the plains. Their night raids on Red Army headquarters became legendary. One commander recalled, "We went to sleep thinking the front was miles away. We woke up with no horses, no machine guns, and a message written in chalk on the wall. Don't disturb freedom while she sleeps." Makhno realized this war was endless. The Reds wouldn't stop until they destroyed anyone who didn't submit. But he wasn't going to become a cog in the new machine. His speeches grew bitter with irony. "Yesterday we beat the landlords and the czars together. Today, those who scream about freedom are building new prisons. Maybe we should just bring back the Romanov crown. At least it would be more honest." Autumn brought new battles and new losses. The Reds threw regular divisions against the Makhnovists, but every victory cost them too much. Only the peasants still considered Nestor one of their own, because he was the only one who didn't come to them with slogans and bayonets at the same time. The war with the Reds was just another chapter in the meat grinder of the Civil War. The irony was that those who called him a hero of the revolution yesterday were calling him a bandit today. But he just laughed. If freedom is banditry, then let the whole world become bandits. The final deal with the devil. The union against Wrangel and the knife in the back. By the autumn of 1920, the Russian Civil War was entering its final phase. General Pyotr Wrangel's white forces had fortified Crimea, turning it into the last citadel of the anti-Bolshevik resistance. Moscow knew that if Wrangel wasn't finished off, the war would drag on, and the new power would remain unstable. But there was one problem. The Makhnovists, yesterday's enemies, were still a force to be reckoned with. And so the Bolsheviks decided to play their old card, a temporary alliance. In September 1920, Lenin and Trotsky ordered the resumption of negotiations with Makhno. A delegation was sent to Nestor with promises: amnesty, recognition of Makhnovist autonomy, weapons and supplies. Just help us defeat Wrangel. You'd think everyone had learned their lesson about friendship a year ago. But the Civil War left no time for grudges. Makhno, already burned by the Reds, met the delegates with a smirk. "So, friends again?" "As long as we have a common enemy, yes," replied one of the commissars. Well, said the Batka, let's try it one more time. But remember, you can't step into the same river twice, though you Bolsheviks love to drown those who swim beside you anyway. The treaty was signed on October 2nd, 1920. The Reds officially recognized the Makhnovist army as an independent insurgent force, promising supplies and immunity. In return, Makhno pledged to move against Wrangel on the southern front. And the Makhnovists went into battle. Their legendary Tachankas raced across the Crimean steppes, striking the white rear. Their raid on Perekop in October became famous, where they broke through the defenses and disorganized Wrangel's units, clearing the way for regular Red divisions. Witnesses recalled Nestor, covered in dust and blood, riding at the head of the column, shouting, "Today, freedom fires faster than dictatorship." The battles for Crimea were one of the most successful examples of joint action between the Makhnovists and the Reds. Even Bolshevik newspapers, which had called Makhno a bandit just days ago, wrote enthusiastically, "Comrade Makhno is crushing the enemy of the revolution." Of course, in tiny print at the end of the article, it added, "Until further notice from the Revolutionary Military Council." By mid-November 1920, Wrangel's army was smashed, and the remnants of the Whites evacuated Crimea for Constantinople. At first glance, it seemed the alliance had worked. But in Bolshevik politics, there was one unwritten rule. An ally is only needed until they stop being useful. And very soon, the Makhnovists felt the weight of that rule. Already in December, Trotsky signed a secret order to liquidate Makhno's army. Telegrams went out to Red staff units. Disarm the Makhnovists, arrest the commanders, suppress any resistance. On the night of December 24th, in Guerrilla, where a joint banquet was being held to celebrate the victory over Wrangel, Red Army units entered the halls. They tried to arrest the Makhnovist commanders right at the table. Legend says a commissar raised a toast to eternal friendship, just as machine guns started knocking at the door. A shootout erupted. Some Makhnovist commanders died there, while others managed to fight their way out of the trap. Nestor, narrowly escaping arrest, gathered what was left of his forces and retreated back into the steppes. "There is your gratitude," he said at a gathering. "We spilled blood so they could build their paradise, and they built a prison and invited us to be the first inmates." The winter campaign of 1921 was the final major stand for the Makhnovists. Their army was exhausted by endless fighting. Yet they continued to wage guerrilla war, striking Red garrisons and supply trains. Moscow threw entire armies against them to finish off the Anarchist plague. But even surrounded, Makhno remained himself, a man who didn't know how to bow his head. They say that when he was surrounded in one village, a commissar offered him his life if he surrendered. Nestor replied, "I can die in the steppe, but I will never die on my knees." By the spring of 1921, the Makhnovist movement was effectively crushed. But the legend of the Batka, who fought every government at once, only grew. Even the Red soldiers fighting against him whispered around campfires, "He might be a bandit, but he's certainly no worse than our commanders." The final alliance with the Bolsheviks became a symbol of the entire Civil War. Temporary truces, betrayals, knives in the back, and endless blood on the steppe roads. And Makhno, looking at another sunset, said, "If freedom requires friends like these, maybe the enemies are more honest." Paris without the steppes. The end of the Batka and the birth of a legend, the last ride. The spring of 1921 was the last for the Makhnovists in their native Ukraine. The Red Army, having finally gathered all its strength, launched a massive scorched earth campaign. What was left of Nestor Makhno's units found themselves surrounded. Many commanders died in lopsided battles, and hundreds of fighters were executed without trial or investigation. But the Batka himself proved to be the one man who couldn't be caught, even in a trap. Through dozens of miles of snow-covered roads, through forests and plains, wounded and exhausted, he and a handful of loyal comrades broke through the border. He left behind the land he loved like a son, a land that had been taken from him by the very revolution he helped ignite. Exile, a revolutionary in a cage. By the summer of 1921, Makhno found himself in Romania, where the authorities were at a loss for what to do with him. On one hand, he was an enemy of the Bolsheviks, which made him potentially useful. On the other, he was an anarchist armed to the teeth with a reputation as an unstoppable rebel. The Romanians chose the simplest path. They disarmed his men and expelled them, wanting to avoid any unnecessary diplomatic headaches. Next came Poland, where Makhno was placed under house arrest. The Polish authorities feared that if they left him free, he'd start a riot among the local street vendors in Warsaw, just for the sport of it. Nestor laughed at their fear. "They think revolution is only about the rifle," he said. "But sometimes, a single word is enough to make the walls crumble." After months of detentions and interrogations, he finally secured passage further west. The Carpenter of Paris. Nestor finally reached France in 1924. Paris met him as a strange ghost of a foreign war. While immigrant circles whispered about his exploits and his legendary Tachankas, the official authorities viewed him as a potential terrorist. Documents were hard to get, and finding work was almost impossible. Instead of a warlord commanding thousands of fighters in the Free Republic of Guerrilla, the world now saw a poor immigrant renting cheap rooms in Parisian slums, struggling to feed his family. He worked as a carpenter, a day laborer, and took on the most grueling jobs on construction sites. Sometimes, fellow anarchists would bring him a little money, but it was barely enough for bread and cheap wine. Almost every evening, Nestor would gather a small group of Russian emigrants and French workers around him. He would tell them stories of the free communes, of how the peasants of Ukraine had felt like the true masters of their land for the first time in centuries. The irony of fate was bitter. In Paris, he was discussed as the king of anarchy, but he lived worse than the poorest laborer back in Guerrilla. Death and the Eternal Ghost. Meanwhile, in Soviet Russia, Makhno's name was turned into an official curse. The newspapers wrote of Makhnovist gangs, of drunkenness, looting, and chaos. But even among the Red soldiers, another version lived on. The story of a fearless commander who served neither Tsar, nor Lenin, nor Trotsky, only the people. The final years of Nestor's life were a slow battle with illness. Old battle wounds began to ache, and tuberculosis was slowly killing him. Doctors advised rest and treatment, but he had neither the money nor the strength for either. Yet, he remained the same man he was in the steppes, ironic, blunt, and ready to argue even with death itself. "I am not afraid to die," he told his friends. "I only fear one thing, that people will forget that freedom cannot be sold." In 1934, Nestor Ivanovich Makhno died in Paris at the age of 45. He passed away quietly, without fanfares or salutes, in a tiny rented room, surrounded by a few loyal comrades. At his funeral, Anarchists from all over Europe, French workers and Russian emigrants gathered to pay their respects. The coffin was carried by those who saw him not as a bandit, but as the last truly free man. The Soviet government did not send a wreath, though they could have, if only out of professional courtesy. But perhaps they understood. Even a dead Makhno was a threat to them. You cannot shoot an idea, and even Trotsky's machine guns couldn't kill a legend. Today, the name of Nestor Makhno has become a symbol of resistance against any dictate, whether czarist, Bolshevik, or bureaucratic. Some consider him a robber, others a folk hero, and others an idealist who dreamed of the impossible. But everyone agrees on one thing. History produces such a man once a century to remind those in power that the people's will for freedom tolerates no masters. The irony of his life is that Makhno fought his whole life for a world without prisons or sovereigns. Yet he died as an exile in a foreign land where his dream remained just that, a dream. But the legend of the Batka from Guerrilla has outlived every government that tried to bury it. As he himself said shortly before his death, "All governments have killed me, but none have defeated me." Epilogue. And so, our story of the man who fought the Tsar, the Germans, the Whites, the Reds, and who, if he had lived a few more years, probably would have fought Martians just to see if they had a dictatorship too, comes to an end. Nestor Makhno lived a life full of blood, dust, and the wind of the steppes. He fought for a freedom that no one else quite understood, and died in a foreign country, never seeing the Ukraine he dreamed of. The ultimate irony is that while every government called him a bandit, none could ever truly kill his name. It still echoes like the rumble of a Tachanka on the horizon, reminding us that freedom and order are two things that rarely sit well in the same carriage. Now, friends, if you are drawn to the stories of people who challenged entire empires and lost only because they were more honest than their enemies, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and ring that bell. History doesn't always write about the winners. Sometimes it just records those who went all the way to the end. And who knows? Maybe in some quiet corner of the plains, under the sound of the ancient wind, you can still hear the thunder of Batka Makhno's wheels.